A modest woman walked into the bank in her running clothes, and the entire lobby laughed at her. But they didn't know she was the wife of one of the most powerful billionaires in America. When the truth came to light, the system they thought unshakable began to tremble. Every morning, before the city fully awoke, Grace Bennett tied her hair back neatly, slipped on her old but sturdy running shoes, and began jogging around the quiet Oak Ridge neighborhood. At 55, many people opted for yoga, spa days, or golf to stay in shape. Grace chose running, not because she wanted to lose weight, but because each step helped her hold on to a part of herself, a part resilient, a part silent, and a part unnoticed, yet unshakable. With her worn baseball cap and simple running gear, no one would guess she was the wife of Jonathan Bennett, the financial titan, one of the top 30 richest people in America. But few needed to know that anyway. To them, she was just kind Grace from the library, the woman who brought cookies to every neighborhood council meeting, remembered every child's birthday, and was always the first to lend a hand when someone needed help. And that was why, that morning, Grace stopped short when she spotted a bright yellow notice pinned to the park's bulletin board. Oak Ridge Community Bank, closure notice in 30 days. She read it carefully. A major financial conglomerate was set to acquire this branch, the little bank where 87-year-old Mr. Henderson still deposited his money every Friday, and where Sam Torres had once taken out a loan to open his first bakery. To many, it was just a tiny local branch. To Grace, it was a symbol, the last breath of an era when banks still knew their customers by name. She called Jonathan. "Honey, I saw the notice. I think I need to stop by there." No need to postpone your meeting. I can handle the first part." Grace didn't change. She didn't go home, reapply lipstick, or put on a blazer. She walked straight to the bank, still in her running clothes, water bottle dangling at her side, face slightly flushed from 5 laps around the park, partly because time waited for no one, partly because it might be interesting to see how people reacted to a plain, middle-aged woman walking into a bank and offering to buy it. When the doors swung open, the air inside was cool, laced with the faint scent of expensive perfume lingering among crisply pressed suits. The first glances her way were curious, then wary, and finally tinged with mild disdain. A young woman at the reception desk asked in a just audible tone, "How can I assist you?" Grace smiled faintly. "I'd like to speak to the manager about the closure notice. Can that be arranged?" The receptionist faltered, whispering into the intercom. A few minutes later, a blonde woman in a sharp gray blazer and heels straight out of a fashion magazine appeared. "Patricia Kensington. I'm the manager. Do you have a complaint?" "Not a complaint," Grace replied, her gaze unwavering. "I want to buy this bank." Patricia paused for a second, then burst out laughing, not out of amusement, but because it was absurd. "You want to buy the bank in that workout gear?" Grace nodded calmly. "I could change, but does your respect come with a blazer?" A few employees in the back stifled giggles. Patricia tried to regain her composure. "This bank isn't some discount item at a supermarket. The current price is $12 million. Grace met her eyes directly. "I'll offer $15 million. The room went silent. A few pairs of eyes began to see Grace differently, no longer just the woman in running clothes. They didn't yet know she hadn't come to win. She'd come to not stay silent. Laughter erupted. A long, sharp, mocking peal echoed through the marble lobby of Oak Ridge Bank. Check under the soles of her sneakers, a man in a charcoal suit guffawed. "Maybe she's hiding $15 million there." Patricia Kensington didn't laugh, but her gaze was unmistakably smug. Her eyes flicked over Grace as if sizing up a lost soul who'd wandered into a board meeting by mistake. She waved a hand, summoning security. "That's enough," Patricia said, her voice sweet as venom. "Ms. Mitchell, next time please make an appointment and wear something that might make people listen." Grace stood still. A dull ache pulsed through her temple, but she didn't speak. She just looked at every smirking face, every prying glance, every approving nod dripping with disdain. And then The bank doors swung open. That sound, simple, crisp, silenced the entire room. The laughter stopped dead. Every head turned. A man stepped over the threshold, a jet-black suit tailored to perfection, a Patek watch glinting at his wrist. His posture unbowed, uninvited, and utterly beyond the need for introduction. Jonathan Bennett. No one could mistake him. No one dared breathe too loudly. Forbes called him the machine that revalues financial empires. Wall Street dubbed him the man who can silence a trading floor with a single look. And now, that man was crossing the marble tiles, each step heavy like an approaching verdict. Grace remained where she stood, unsurprised, unspeaking. Jonathan's eyes locked on Patricia, ignoring everyone else. "Did you just reject my wife's offer to buy this bank?" His voice was low, deliberate, and cold as steel on glass. Patricia froze. I didn't know she was..." "Wrong order," Jonathan cut her off, unblinking. "You don't need to know who she is to show basic respect." The air in the room thickened. Those who'd laughed moments ago now stared at the floor, as if it might swallow them to spare the humiliation. James Wilson, the regional director, hurried forward, extending a hand. "Mr. Bennett, an honor to meet you. If you're here, I'm sure we can rearrange things more reasonably." Jonathan didn't shake his hand. He pulled a business card from his inner pocket and placed it on the glass table like an irrevocable seal. "My lawyer will be in touch. My offer, $15 million, but given your hospitality," he lifted his gaze, sweeping over the petrified faces. "Make it 14. Patricia's mouth fell open. "And by the way," Jonathan added, stepping closer to her, "you just threw away the best career opportunity of your life." He turned to Grace and offered his hand. "Let's go, darling." Grace placed her hand in his. Steady. Unhurried, they walked out of the bank in silence. The eyes behind them followed, no longer daring to breathe. Jonathan didn't look back, but before pushing the door, he left one final statement. Low, cold, and indisputable. As of tomorrow, this bank will have a new name and a new standard. The meeting room was so quiet that the faint ticking of Jonathan Bennett's wristwatch could be heard clearly. James Wilson stood across from him, his spine rigid as if trying to rebuild the dignity that had just been swept away. Beside him, Patricia Kensington bit her lower lip, her hands gripping an empty folder tightly in front of her, as though it might salvage her honor if she squeezed hard enough. Jonathan looked straight at James. No anger, no raised voice, just cold. The kind of cold that reminded everyone he was a man who could buy their careers with a single signet. "We'll settle on 14 million, Jonathan said, his voice as soft as an autumn breeze, "because I believe a lesson sometimes deserves a discount." James swallowed hard. "Of course, we deeply appreciate your generosity." "No," Jonathan raised a hand, cutting off the excuse. "Don't call it generosity. Call it what it is. The cost of disrespect." Patricia squirmed, looking like someone who'd just sipped cold tea laced with vinegar. "Not recording it for Lux Group's customer service course," she continued, turning to Jonathan. "What do you think? Should we send a summary to HR?" Jonathan nodded slowly, no trace of a smile. "I think we should attach a termination letter." Patricia's face went pale. "But, don't worry," Grace said, still wearing that faint smile. "We're not here to strip away career opportunities. I'm sure fast food chains are still hiring people skilled at identifying designer shoes and guessing net worth from t-shirt logos." The words landed, light as a feather, but sharp as a blade. Patricia froze, her lips trembled, but no sound came out. Grace turned to James. "And Mr. Wilson, thank you for suggesting I take a finance basics class at the community college," she said, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "I just called the dean. He said he'd be delighted if you'd guest lecture a few sessions on how to miss a billionaire client standing right in front of you." The room seemed to freeze solid. Jonathan glanced at his watch. "We have a meeting with the legal team at 2. I suggest you start preparing the transfer documents." Then he turned to Grace. "What would you like to drink before we go?" Grace nodded gently, a sugar-free latte. They left. The glass door closed behind them with a soft click, much like the end of a chess game, with white claiming absolute victory. The air in the bank's grand lobby seemed to thicken. Every employee, from those who had once smirked to those who had watched in silence, stood motionless. Before them was Grace Bennett, still in her simple running clothes, her silver hair tied back neatly, her sneakers dusted with the morning dew. But this time, no one dared to judge, because this woman, alongside her husband, had just made an offer to buy the bank that outstripped even the bid from a national financial conglomerate. And because of that look in her eyes, warm yet resolute, the gaze of someone who had weathered years of highs and lows and understood that true value didn't lie in appearances, Grace stepped up onto a small platform in the middle of the lobby, turning to face the crowd. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried clearly, low and deep, resonating more than it overpowered the noise. I know. This morning, many of you looked at me and thought, what's she doing here? Some thought I was lost. Some thought I was here to complain about a bad loan. And some, I remember clearly, laughed because I wasn't wearing high heels. A few faces turned downward. I don't blame anyone. I've lived long enough to understand this society is programmed to judge the outside before listening to the voice. But that's exactly why I'm standing here today. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was as solid as forged steel. This bank, Oak Ridge Community Bank, isn't just a place to deposit money. It's where Sam Torres got approved for a loan to open his restaurant after being turned down 3 times by bigger banks. It's where Mrs. Henderson, 87 years old, still trusts her pension because the staff know her name, not just her account number. She gestured toward the wall where black and white photos of past community events hung. I stood here 20 years ago, denied a loan to open a small bookstore just because I was a woman, single, and didn't drive a fancy car. Right here in this lobby I learned something. Real value never lies in a suit or an expensive watch. Her voice softened, but her eyes didn't shed a single tear. My husband and I, now capable of buying this bank 10 times over if we wanted, aren't doing this for fame. We're doing it for one reason alone, to preserve something that's fading from this society: kindness. She turned toward the employees. I don't need you to bow. I just hope that, starting tomorrow, when someone walks through that door, whether they're in a hoodie or a silk suit, you'll look into their eyes before you look at their bag. Because you don't know what stories, what dreams, or what wounds they're carrying. Pausing for a beat, she ended with a statement heavy with purpose. If this bank is to survive, it will be under one condition. It must earn the right to be called community. If it can't, we'll let it die and rebuild it from scratch, the right way. The lobby fell utterly silent, a long, unbroken stillness. Then someone began to clap. 1 beat, 2. Then the entire bank erupted in applause, swelling like a wave. No one prompted it, because in that moment they no longer saw a woman in running clothes. They saw the leader this bank should have had all along. The silence stretched on after Grace Bennett's speech. The air in the bank's lobby remained heavy, as if even the marble tiles beneath their feet felt ashamed. Some employees avoided each other's gazes, while others swallowed quietly. The arrogance from earlier, the snickers, the jabs about her hoodie and sneakers, had dissolved like soap bubbles, leaving behind a quiet layer of ash. And then a voice broke through. Small, hoarse, but steady like a bronze bell ringing through the morning mist. Mrs. Bennett, please, wait a moment. Everyone turned. A middle-aged woman with a slight build, her salt and pepper hair neatly tied back, stepped out from behind the teller counter. She adjusted her slightly crooked name tag, Nancy Myers, senior teller. She straightened up, hands clasped together, clearly unused to speaking in front of a crowd, but her eyes burned with resolve. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, she spoke. I've worked at this bank for 22 years, back when we still wrote ledgers in blue ink and dialed rotary phones to check loans. I've seen countless families come here with hope and leave with tears or smiles. The entire lobby held its breath. I'm not a boss. I don't own shares. I'm just an ordinary employee still bringing packed lunches from home. But I know this. This bank used to be part of the community, not just a machine. She turned to Grace and bowed her head. This morning when I saw you walk in wearing running clothes, I thought, probably another person asking about the branch closing. I was wrong, not because you're Mr. Bennett's wife, but because I looked at you with eyes hardened by too many busy days, forgetting to see the person underneath. Grace nodded slightly, her gaze softening. Nancy turned to her colleagues, those who had laughed the loudest, who now stared at the floor. I'm not defending anyone, but I believe if none of us stand up and speak the truth today, we'll lose more than our jobs. We'll lose our professional dignity. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward again, hands trembling but voice firm. I want to stay, not for the paycheck, but because I want to work somewhere that puts human dignity first. If this bank changes hands, and the new owner is someone like Mrs. Bennett, I'm willing to start over, learn everything anew, just to be part of something right. A wave of quiet emotion spread through the room. Then, unexpectedly, a young employee, clearly an intern, stepped out from behind the counter. Me too. I've only been here 6 months, but this morning I laughed when you walked in. I'm sorry. I've learned more in the last 10 minutes today than in 3 months of training. The sound of a chair scraping. Another employee stood up, then another. In the middle of the lobby, those who had sat silently or joined the crowd's jeers began to nod, rising to their feet one by one, each pair of eyes joining the shift. Grace looked around the room, a gentle smile spreading across her lips, not out of triumph, but because the change had already begun from within. The atmosphere in the bank's lobby still carried the echoes of transformation. After Nancy Myers and several employees spoke up in support, the crowd fell silent. No more laughter, no more disdainful glances. They stood in a strange stillness, a space where personal honor and truth had just claimed their rightful place. Patricia Kensington stood behind the counter, rigid as a wax figure. Her face no longer bore the confident smirk of an arrogant branch manager, her lips pressed tight, her spine stiff as a final barricade against the humiliation swelling through her veins. And then, as if she had nothing left to lose, Patricia took a step forward. She tried to muster a polite smile, but it twisted more into a grimace than kindness. I think there might have been some misunderstandings. This morning, she said, her voice thin as paper, all just due to procedures and professional expectations. No one responded. She turned to Grace, her eyes searching for some escape in the gaze of the woman she'd once mocked for her sneakers and old hoodie. I hope we can work together to build a more positive relationship. Grace didn't reply. She simply looked at Patricia, a look that was calm, not angry, not mocking, just right, and so piercing it needed no words. That silence spread like a cold mist. It didn't shout, didn't attack, it simply existed, like a mirror reflecting everything Patricia had displayed since morning, her arrogance, her prejudice, her bias. A few employees lowered their heads. Patricia still clung on. I didn't mean to offend. We were just following standards. Grace tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering, as if asking, what standard justifies dismissing someone over running clothes? A young employee stepped back, shoulders trembling faintly with shame. Nancy stared at the floor, lips pressed tight, silent. Patricia exhaled sharply, and for the first time that day, she had no more words. Not because anyone stopped her, but because she knew every word now would only expose her insincerity further. Grace turned away, offering no response, no lingering, just a slight nod to her husband, Jonathan, before stepping down the marble stairs of the lobby, her sneakers tapping softly and steadily with each stride. Behind her, the entire bank stood frozen. Patricia remained there, as if petrified in a room full of averted eyes. No more laughter to cling to, no ladder of prestige to climb with a faint smile or a tactical handshake. And in that silence, no one said a thing, because the truth had already been laid bare. One woman had walked in wearing worn sneakers, needing to prove nothing about who she was. Another stood there, still in a suit, but with nothing left. No one dared to speak. The vast lobby suddenly felt cramped under the invisible pressure emanating from the man walking slowly toward the center. Jonathan Mitchell, white shirt without a single crease, sleeves rolled up high, moved with steps that seemed to compress the air with every beat. He stopped in the middle of the semicircle of faces that had mocked his wife earlier that morning. The light reflected off the glossy marble floor. A cold breeze from the air conditioning system brushed through, but nothing was colder than his voice. "I only need exactly 3 minutes." His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for everyone to hear. Not a single person dared to move. Jonathan looked straight at James Wilson, the regional director, standing rigid as if he'd just been yanked out of a failed performance. He didn't wait for a greeting, nor did he need an explanation. This morning, a guest walked in here, presenting a serious business proposal with clear goodwill and a motive for the community, and she was treated as if she were a trivial nuisance. Jonathan turned his head, his gaze sweeping past Patricia before lingering for a few seconds on the group of employees behind her, the ones who had snickered, sneered, whistled, and turned away when a single act of decency was most needed. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "We will proceed with the acquisition of this branch within 7 business days," Jonathan continued, his voice steady like a financial news report. "During that time, I request that the entire management team and mid-level staff prepare a self-assessment of their professional conduct, along with a personal account of what happened this morning." The bank lobby fell into a suffocating silence. Jonathan paused for a beat, then enunciated each word clearly. "Anyone who appears in the security footage displaying inappropriate behavior, including smirking, showing discriminatory attitudes, or contributing to the belittlement of a client, will have their eligibility to work in the new banking system reviewed. No exceptions." James's face drained of color. Patricia stood still, lips pressed tight, her eyes trembling. A few employees began glancing at each other, anxious. The jovial atmosphere from earlier that morning had vanished. In its place was a stark truth. They had ruined their own reputations through carelessness, shallowness, and arrogance. Jonathan stepped toward the reception desk. His hand tapped lightly on the glass surface. "Attitude shapes culture, and culture is the greatest asset in any organization. Those who don't understand that don't need to stay." He turned, his gaze sweeping across the lobby one last time, as if sealing an irrevocable decree. "We're not buying this bank just to own the premises. We're buying it to change how people are treated in a place that should symbolize trust." He turned toward Grace, who stood silently at the bottom of the lobby steps. "Let's go." She gave a slight nod. No one saw them off. No one dared to speak. The automatic glass doors slid open ahead, afternoon light streaming in like a final cleansing breath, and Jonathan Mitchell walked out of the bank, leaving behind a powerful lesson in professional ethics and the clear consequences of misjudging someone based solely on appearances. That noon, Grace Mitchell returned to Miller Park, where it had all begun. The community bulletin board was still there, the yellow notice about the bank's closure torn at one corner by the wind. But instead of anger or gloom, today Grace stood before it with a different light in her eyes, clarity. A group of high school students passed by, their cheerful laughter making her smile faintly. She remembered herself decades ago, another young person like them, full of hope but easily subdued by prejudiced glances. And then, Years, failures, and moments of being unheard had taught her to stay silent to survive, but to live merely to exist. What was that but a tree too afraid to stretch toward the sun? She touched the wooden board lightly as if brushing against her own past. Sometimes what breaks us isn't the insult, but believing we deserve to be treated that way. Grace's voice was soft, almost a soliloquy, but behind her a few people had stopped. A middle-aged man, the coffee shop owner from the corner, nodded. A young mother holding her child paused too. At some point, Grace was no longer just the old housewife in the worn-out baseball cap. Today she was a mirror, reflecting how society had treated itself. They laughed at my old jacket, but did anyone ask why I wear it every day? Did anyone know it was the first thing I bought with money from selling used books outside the city library? Grace turned around, her gaze not angry but deep, like a still lake. I don't need pity, but I think we need to say this to each other. No one deserves to be looked down on just because they don't fit some fashionable standard. A young man stepped closer, quietly filming her with his phone. Grace didn't notice. She wasn't speaking to become famous. She spoke because it was time for those who'd been hurt to step out of their own shadows. I'm not telling this to be praised as a heroine. I'm just a woman who loves her community, who loves the faces that have lived here through generations, and if we let places like Oak Ridge Bank be swallowed up by cold corporations, it's not just a building that disappears. It's trust. By now the crowd had grown. A few former bank employees were there too. Some bowed their heads, others shed tears, but Grace didn't accuse them. She knew systems breed prejudice, but it's up to us whether we live by it. I don't need anyone to apologize. I just hope that the next time a woman in workout clothes walks into a bank, you'll smile instead of judge. She stopped. The air was still as a mirror. Then a round of applause broke out, not the loud, excited kind, but a quiet, empathetic, sincere one. And for the first time in years, Grace no longer felt like an outsider. Today, she had become a voice for herself and for so many others who'd once been deemed not enough. That morning, the sky over Oak Ridge stretched wide in a pure, cleansing blue, as if the small town had just been washed clean of the dust of prejudice. On the path alongside Miller Park, Grace Mitchell's old running shoes rhythmically met the ground. Each step was unhurried, unpretentious, just a middle-aged woman in a worn baseball cap, a faded windbreaker, holding a water bottle with a simple heart, once overlooked, now moving among people who had just learned the greatest lesson about respect. The sign that had once dangled, announcing the bank closure, had been replaced by a new poster. Oak Ridge Community Bank, rebuilt for the community. Below it in smaller print, welcoming all customers, regardless of appearance, balance, or circumstance. A group of young employees stepped out of the bank, smiling and greeting Grace as she jogged by. Among them was Nancy, once hesitant to voice her support, now the manager of the Community Outreach Department, leading financial programs for low-income residents. There was also James. No longer the arrogant executive, but a reform advisor, relearning the first lesson in humility. Jonathan Mitchell stood in the distance, leaning against an old wooden railing, coffee in hand, watching his wife's figure. He didn't need to say a word. He knew Grace had changed the entire system, not with the power of money, but with the quiet resilience of kindness and faith in humanity. She ran past the elementary school playground, where a group of children waved and called out, "Miss Grace, are you the one who bought the bank?" She smiled, slowing down, and replied as lightly as the breeze, "No, I'm just someone who wouldn't stay. But when I saw something wrong." The kids clapped and giggled. They didn't fully grasp the meaning of what Grace had said, but their eyes sparkled as if they understood that a simple woman could do something extraordinary. At the crossroads where a small bookstore Grace had once started stood, there was now a community financial scholarship center called G-Mem Hope House, funded by the Mitchells. There, every week, young people learned about finance, not just to get rich, but to become kind and independent. Grace stopped, taking a deep breath. The wind rustled through the trees, gentle, the scent of damp earth, the aroma of bread from a nearby bakery, and the chime of a bicycle bell from an old man pedaling by, all blended into a peaceful melody. She looked down at her old shoes, the ones that had stepped into the bank as an outsider, mocked, dismissed because she didn't look like someone with money. Now they were a symbol of a journey, from disdain to transformation. Grace kept running. She didn't need to stand on a pedestal of glory. She didn't need anyone to call her a heroine. All she needed was to step outside each morning with a free heart in a world that had come to realize kindness is never weakness. It's the foundation on which any system can stand strong. And so, Grace's footsteps echoed steadily along the familiar road. No one could have imagined that running in running clothes could rewrite the rules of an entire system. But she did, by remaining herself. A week after the incident at Oak Ridge Bank's headquarters, the atmosphere in the small town seemed to settle, not out of fear, but in anticipation of something just being restored. At a press conference held in the very lobby where mocking laughter once echoed, the air now carried the sound of commitments and apologies. Jonathan Mitchell, dressed in an elegant gray suit, stepped up to the podium. Beside him stood Grace, the woman once dismissed, now standing shoulder to shoulder with him as a living symbol of the revival of human values. The lights dimmed, live cameras rolled, all eyes turned to them. "We stand here today," Jonathan began, his voice clear and resolute, not just to declare new ownership of Oak Ridge Community Bank, but to restore what has been lost: dignity. The room was so silent you could hear the faint rustle of paper from the reporters' desks. Grace took over, her voice not loud but carrying the strength of someone who'd been pushed into a corner and now stepped into the light with her own kindness. This bank isn't just a place to hold money. It was once a place that held trust, and we're here to rebuild that, not with marble or advertisements, but with respect for every person who walks through these doors. She paused, her gaze settling on the employees seated in the front row, some of whom had once mocked her, now bowing their heads. "I'm not here for revenge," she said softly, "but to set things right." After the speech, Jonathan announced a pivotal decision, a complete restructuring of the executive team, placing dedicated individuals like Nancy in leadership roles. A new community council was established, with the authority to advise on bank policies, composed of local residents, small business owners, and retirees. But it didn't stop there. He revealed a $10 million investment in an Oak Ridge financial equality program, collateral-free loans for small businesses, personal finance management training for low-income individuals, and a scholarship fund for underprivileged. Oak Ridge didn't just keep its bank. It preserved the soul of a community that every balance sheet had overlooked. At the end of the press conference, Grace looked out through the glass doors, where people were lining up not to withdraw money, but to open new accounts. Because they knew from now on, they'd be treated as people, not numbers. And so, in a small town under gentle golden sunlight, a bank was reborn. Not just with money, but with justice, trust, and the restoration of dignity once lost. This story reminds us, a person's true worth isn't in their appearance, but in how we treat one another. Thank you for joining this journey with Millionaire and Heart Stories. See you again in the next healing and inspiring stories.